So what we're going to take a look at today is graphing sine and cosine curves. What we have here is y equals -2 times cosine of pi over 2 times x. And just before we even get to that, it's important to understand what our basic sine and cosine curves are going to look like, and just really understanding where the critical values are for each of these. You know, we have a critical value here at 0, 0. We have a maximum here of pi over 2, comma 1. We have a 0 here of pi, comma 0. Here we have a minimum of 3 pi over 2, comma -1. And then at the end of the period we have a 0 at 2 pi, comma 0. And it's going to be important to know these 5 critical values, especially when we look at more complex versions of these graphs. Cosine curve will look something like this. And again, we want to know these 5 critical values. Anywhere there's a maximum, minimum, or a 0. This one would be the point 0, 1. This would be the point pi, comma 0. I'm sorry, pi over 2, comma 0. This would be the point pi, comma -1. This would be 3 pi over 2, comma 0. And that one would be 2 pi, comma 1. So we have those critical values for cosine, we have these critical values for sine, and just knowing our basic shape should look something like this, even if it's manipulated, stretched out, shrunk, stretched vertically, flipped over the x-axis. It'll still have some basic shape like these two. Now to this question. What we have here, we have a stretch on the amplitude, and we have a change of the period looking at this graph. What the -2 does in the front is it changes our amplitude. Okay, that number in the front, the absolute value of it, tells us our amplitude, or the height of the graph from the midline, so from a maximum back to the midline. So in this case, our amplitude would be 2. To identify our period, what we have to go through and do is use the formula 2 pi over b. What b is, it ends up being this number that multiplies our variable on the inside of the cosine function. So in this case, our b value would be pi over 2. So what I'm going to go through and do would be 2 pi over 2, and I need to reduce that. What I have is a fraction in the denominator, so dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I multiply all these together, the pi's would cancel, and what that gives me is that the period is 4. So what that's telling me is from the start of the pattern to the end of the pattern, we're going to go 4 ticks across the x-axis. So I'm going to go and I'm going to label those right now. I'm going to have 4, I would have 2, I would have 3, and I would have 1, with this being 0 here. Now, what I need to do is I need to figure out what the points are going to be. I know my amplitude is going to be 2. So that means maximums will be at a y value of 2, and minimums are going to be at a y value of -2. And basically what I have to look at is, alright, it's going to look just like this cosine curve. So, maximum 0, minimum 0, back up to a maximum. What changed that actually is this negative sign. And I know we've discussed it in class. What the negative sign does to any graph is it flips it over the x-axis. Like this, everything is going to be flipped. So we would actually start at a minimum, come up to a maximum, 0, and then back down. So that's how our curve is going to look. And we can do that first by labeling these. So we'll label each tick mark as 2. That means we would start at a minimum, and we would start at the point 0, 2. And at the end of the period, we should end up back at a minimum. We should have a maximum directly in the middle because it's the opposite of this. So it should be right here, and I should have zeros at those 2 points. So basically what our curve should look like, something along those lines. And what's going to be important is labeling the critical values. So actually labeling what those 5 points are. You could do it right on the graph, you could do it on the side. This point would be 0, -2. This point would be 1, 0. This point would be 2, 2. This point would be 3, 0, and our last point would be 4, -2. Those would be our 5 critical values for this graph, and that's all we'd really be looking for in terms of any sine or cosine graph.